So I was just saying this brings us to the point of what are human rights. And I was saying pause the video and see if you can remember that definition we gave earlier. Human rights are the rights to which all human beings are entitled simply by virtue of being human. So this means there's three characteristics we can identify of human rights. If we want to go into a bit more depth. And by the way, just exam-related tip, when would and wouldn't it be appropriate to go into this amount of depth? Well, certainly if you had a 50-mark question on what are human rights, certainly you would. If you had any other question about human rights, you might want to refer to some of this as well in the introduction, but you wouldn't have to. Perhaps in a 45-mark question you would, because you've got a bit more time to go into it. But a lot of the time we say there's three overriding specific characteristics of human rights. One, and most importantly I would say, is that they are universal. By universal, that means applicable to all. Yep. In other words, they belong to all humans, regardless of, as I said, their race, their religion, their gender, whatever, their marital status, whether they're a prisoner or not, yeah, their sexual orientation. So if you're a human being, you're entitled to these rights, full stop. There's no category of humans they do not apply to. So that's what we mean by universal, applicable to all. Major characteristic of human rights. If they're not universal, then we can't really say they're human rights. There's a distinction, by the way, between civil rights, which are the rights belonging to citizens of a particular country, and human rights, which are the rights belonging to all humans. So you have your civil rights or your civic rights by virtue of being a citizen of Britain or whatever, or a citizen of the United States or citizen of whatever state you're part of. You have certain rights because you're a citizen of that state. Human rights are a little different. So human rights are the rights you have just by virtue of being human. Okay, so first characteristic, they're universal. Second, we say they're inalienable or fundamental. There's overlap between these 3 points, by the way, but here we're saying they cannot be taken away. Inalienable, they cannot be alienated from you, cannot be taken away from you. So they can't be, as I said, even criminals and so on are still entitled to their human rights. I'm going to say, oh, everyone's got human rights unless they do X, Y, or Z. No, everyone's got human rights, full stop. So this came out, for example, when the European Court of Human Rights ruled that prisoners must have the right to vote in the UK, which, as we know from AS politics, they don't. Prisoners in the UK do not have the right to vote in general elections. It's something that's removed from them. The European Court ruled that breaches their human rights. Yeah, it's their human right to have a vote. Another example, Amnesty International campaigns for all countries in the world to uphold and respect the Universal Declaration. Now, one of the articles in the Universal Declaration is the right to life. So Amnesty International campaign against the death penalty. They say whatever crime you've committed, even if it's the most horrific crime, act of terrorism, murder, rape, anything, people still have the right to life. They're still human, they still have the right to life, so the death penalty should never be applied in any circumstance. So they're inalienable. They can't be taken away from people, but whatever that person has done. They're inalienable or fundamental. Third characteristic, we can say they're absolute. And again, there's a lot of crossover and overlap here. But here we're saying they're total. They can't be limited or qualified. So for example, human rights should not be suspended due to a wartime emergency, for example. So a couple of examples, if we go back to World War II, in the USA, for example, all Japanese people in the USA were locked up. Now that would be a breach of their human rights. You can't say, oh, just because it's a war, therefore certain groups, their rights are suspended. No, human rights are absolute. They cannot be made conditional or qualified or time limited or anything like that. The other example I was going to give was when actually members of the British Union of Fascists were all locked up in Britain during the Second World War. Again, this could be seen as a breach of their human rights, their freedom of association. So that would breach the absolute nature of human rights. So really those are 3 characteristics we can talk of, and in a way they're all just fleshing out the same point, that these apply to all humans in all circumstances, whatever they've done or whatever the external context. So the 3 characteristics, they're universal, applicable to all, They're inalienable or fundamental. They cannot be taken away or removed from people. And they're absolute. They're total. They cannot be qualified or made conditional. Okay, so final thing I want to talk about in this lecture is go into a bit of detail about the different types of human rights. And we often talk about 3 types of human rights, or 3 generations of human rights, it's sometimes known as, because they've all come to prominence at different times in history. So there is, first of all, might need to refer to my notes on this one. See what I can do from memory. Good test for me. So the first generation of human rights is civil and political rights. These are often thought to have emerged from the concept of natural rights that was advocated by liberal philosophers in the 17th century. So this is around the time of the English Civil War. Remember when Parliament were going to war against the king for the things like parliamentary sovereignty, for the right of Parliament to create laws rather than the king. And the Glorious Revolution of 1688 that really entrenched that concept of parliamentary sovereignty. And the philosopher of the Glorious Revolution, as he was known, a man called John Locke, is really kind of the godfather, the founding father of liberalism, if you like. And he talked about this concept of natural rights, things which we can really see as an early formulation of human rights. So he talked about there being 3 fundamental natural rights, as he called them, which were the rights to life, liberty, and property. So this so-called first generation of human rights, civil and political rights, they were put forward by the English Revolution, the Glorious Revolution, the French Revolution and American Revolutions of about 100 years later, of the late 18th century. All 3 of these revolutions overthrew the monarch, or at least in the English case, massively reduced the power of the monarch. Closely associated with liberalism, this set of rights. So it would be things, we mentioned some of the civil and political rights before, things like freedom from discrimination would be included, from freedom from slavery, freedom from torture, from arbitrary arrest, and so on. Again, I should make a distinction here between what these guys seem to be advocating and what they actually practiced in principle. As we know, the leaders of the American Revolution, the so-called founding fathers, were many of them slave owners. So this kind of doesn't fit, does it, with this idea that they're advocating human rights and freedom from torture and freedom from slavery at the same time as they're keeping slaves. Seems to be a contradiction. What we have to be aware of here is that a lot of these early liberals basically didn't define Africans as human beings. So that's how they got around that one. Yes, human rights apply to all humans. Oh, but you're not human and you're not human, and so on. That's a footnote, that's an important one. So civil and political rights, we're talking about the classic civil liberties, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly, it's the right to demonstrate basically, freedom of association, the right to join any organization or political party you want, freedom of movement. These are the classic civil liberties, and I mentioned this concept before. They're often thought of as negative freedoms or negative rights. Not negative in the sense that they're bad, negative in the sense that basically they just involve the government not doing something. So they're rights that you have by virtue of the government just ceasing to interfere. Yeah. So normally if we think about freedom of religion, we would normally think, well, it would be the state, the government, that would interfere with your freedom of religion by imposing that you must be a Catholic, or you must be a Protestant, or you must be a Muslim, or whatever. So they're called negative freedom, or your freedom of the press would be interfered with by government censorship, right? Or freedom of association would be interfered with by the state or the government banning certain organizations. So these are called negative freedoms in the sense that you have them so long as the government isn't interfering with your life. And so the government just has to kind of stand back. This is key to this liberal idea of there being a private sphere, like your religion, your lifestyle, your work and so on, that's none of the government's business. So as long as the government keeps out of the private sphere, doesn't interfere in religion and freedom of association and so on, then you have those negative freedoms. So they're called negative freedoms. There's the first generation of human rights, civil and political rights. The second generation... Oh, hi, Lou. I'm going to pause for a second. Yeah.